You pick up two magnets and you bring them close together. They pull. You push them apart. They resist. You can feel it in your hands as if something invisible is straining, stretching, insisting on its own rules. And the first honest question is not, why do magnets attract? That question comes later. The truly disturbing question is much simpler and much harder to shake off. What's between them? Because your hands feel something, not metaphorically, physically. Your muscles tense. Your skin senses pressure. Something is happening in the empty space where, according to common sense, there is absolutely nothing at all. Now, if you ask most people what's between the magnets, they'll say, nothing, it's empty space. And that answer sounds sensible until you realize it doesn't explain a thing. Empty space, by definition, doesn't do anything. It doesn't pull, it doesn't push, it doesn't care. And yet here you are, fingers trembling slightly, as though the air itself has opinions. This is where the trouble begins. Imagine you close your eyes and very slowly move the magnets together. You're not touching them. No contact, no gears, no strings, no little hooks jumping across the gap. Still, your hands feel a force that grows stronger the closer they get. That means something is changing continuously in that space, smoothly, predictably, almost politely, and that's already strange because we're used to causes that involve touching. One thing bangs into another. One thing pushes another. Here, nothing touches anything, and yet the universe is clearly busy doing something. People sometimes say, well, it's just magnetism. But that's like saying, it works because it works. You might as well say, they attract because they attract. It feels like an explanation, but it isn't. It's a label. And labels are wonderful for conversations and terrible for understanding. So let's do something dangerous. Let's take the question seriously. What's between the magnets? Now, if you grew up in a world of solid objects, you probably imagine the universe as mostly empty with little hard bits floating around. Atoms here, magnets there, and between them, a kind of cosmic nothingness. That picture is very comforting. It means if something happens, it must be because two things touched or collided. It fits our instincts. It fits our childhood experiences. It fits the way tables behave when you stub your toe. But magnets don't care about your instincts. They seem to reach across space. And the reach is not vague. It has direction. It has strength. It has structure. If you rotate one magnet, the pull changes. If you flip it around, the pull becomes a push. That means whatever is between them knows which way the magnets are facing. Think about that for a moment. The space itself seems to be informed, as if the emptiness has instructions. You might say, okay, maybe something invisible is flowing between them. That's a natural idea. People have imagined all sorts of invisible fluids, tiny threads, ethereal winds, little messengers darting back and forth. But here's the problem. If something is flowing, where does it come from? Where does it go? And why does it arrange itself so neatly every time? With no noise, no friction, no mess. You can put a sheet of paper between the magnets, still works. Put plastics, put glass, still works. Put vacuum, still works even better, because now there's even less stuff to blame. Whatever's between the magnets doesn't care about ordinary matter. It passes through it as if it's barely there, which is ironic because ordinary matter is supposed to be the real stuff. This is where the paradox tightens its grip. If space is empty, it shouldn't be able to store energy. But the magnets clearly have energy when they're held apart. Let go, and that energy turns into motion. Where was that energy hiding? Not in the magnets alone, because the configuration matters. It depends on how far apart they are, how they're oriented, how they're arranged in space. That tells you something unsettling. The energy belongs to the space between them as much as to the magnets themselves. In other words, the space is doing some of the work. Now that's a sentence that makes people uncomfortable. Space doing work, space having properties, space storing energy. We like space to be a passive stage where actors perform, a quiet backdrop, a nothing. But magnets refuse to behave on a polite stage. They demand a stage that pushes back. I remember once trying to explain this to someone who insisted there must be tiny hooks on the magnets or microscopic fingers reaching out and grabbing the other side. I said, all right, suppose that's true. What are those hooks attached to? And they said, the magnet. And I said, fine. Now what are the hooks moving through? And they said, space. And I said, so space must allow hooks to move through it, line up, pull, and transfer force. That's already more complicated than admitting space has some structure. You see, every attempt to avoid giving space any character ends up sneaking character back in through the back door. When you bring magnets together, you can map the force. You can predict it. You can draw graceful curves that show how the influence spreads out and bends around. And these curves aren't imaginary decorations. They correspond to real measurements, real forces. real consequences. They tell you how a compass needle will turn, how iron filings will arrange themselves, how another magnet will behave if you introduce it into the scene. And here's the key point that sneaks up on you: those patterns exist whether or not you look at them. The magnet doesn't wait for iron filings to show up before it decides how to act. The structure is already there. The space already knows what to do. So now we're stuck with a choice, and neither option is comfortable. Either we accept that objects can mysteriously influence each other across empty nothingness with no intermediary at all, or we accept that space itself is not empty in the way we thought. It has properties. It can be stretched, twisted, energized, and shaped. Most people, when faced with this choice, hesitate, because both options feel like cheating. One feels like magic. The other feels like betrayal. We grew up being told that nothing means nothing, and magnets calmly demonstrate that nothing is one of the busiest things in the universe. What makes this especially mischievous is that you can't point to what's between the magnets. You can't scoop it into a jar. You can't isolate it on a table. You can only infer it by what it does, by how your hands feel, by how objects move, by how patterns emerge. It's like trying to understand the rules of a game by watching the pieces move without ever seeing the rule book. And yet, the rules are precise, unreasonably precise. The force doesn't flicker, it doesn't hesitate. It follows mathematical relationships with almost arrogant confidence. As if the universe is saying, you may not like how this works, but I assure you it works. So here you are, holding two magnets, unknowingly holding a philosophical crisis in your hands. Because if the space between them is doing something real, then space is no longer just where things happen. Space is part of what happens. And once that idea takes root, it doesn't stay politely confined to magnets. It starts leaking into everything else: light, electricity, gravity, time. Suddenly, the question, what's between the magnets, doesn't sound small anymore. It sounds like the beginning of a much larger argument with reality itself. If you'd like me to continue, say the word, and we'll keep following this invisible trail a little deeper. So let's play a little game, because when something refuses to make sense, the best response is to poke it gently and see how it squirms. Take one magnet and move it around in the air. Nothing dramatic happens. Now bring a second magnet nearby and suddenly the air seems to have rules. There are directions that feel easy and directions that feel stubborn. It's almost as if the space itself has grown grooves like invisible rails guiding how things prefer to move. That's already a hint that whatever is between the magnets isn't a thing sitting there, but a condition of the space itself. People often want to imagine magnetism as a kind of message sent from one magnet to the other. A signal that says, hey you, come over here, or sometimes, stay away. But if that's the case, you'd expect some kind of delay, some tiny moment where one magnet decides something and the other reacts later. Yet as far as your hands can tell, the force is just there, stable, immediate, as if the magnets and the space between them are participating in the same agreement. Here's a simpler picture, not because it's simpler in reality, but because it's closer to how your intuition actually works. Imagine space as a stretchy fabric. I know everyone uses that analogy, and it's dangerous because people start thinking it's literally cloth, which it isn't. But bear with me. If you stretch a fabric in one place, you affect how things move nearby. A marble rolls differently. Paths curve, not because the marble is being pulled by the fabric in a personal way, but because the fabric defines what straight even means. Now, magnets don't stretch space like gravity does, but they do something just as mischievous. They define directions. They assign preferences. If you put a tiny compass between two magnets, it doesn't spin randomly. It lines up, faithfully, obediently, as if the space is whispering instructions into its ear. What's remarkable is that the compass isn't learning anything new when you insert it. The information was already there. The compass is just revealing it, like dust showing you the shape of a breeze. This is where iron filings become such an irresistible temptation. Sprinkle them around a magnet and suddenly the invisible becomes theatrical. Graceful arcs appear like a choreographed dance. People often say, look, that's the magnetic field. And that's fine as long as you don't secretly imagine the lines are physical strings. They're not, they're a map, a summary, a way of saying, if you put something sensitive here, this is how it will behave. But notice what's really happening. You didn't create the pattern by sprinkling the filings. You revealed a structure that was already present. The filings merely complied. This is a subtle but crucial shift. Instead of thinking that magnets directly act on other objects, you begin to think that magnets modify the space around them and objects respond to that modification. It's the difference between shouting commands and rearranging the floor so that walking naturally takes you where you want to go. And now the question, What's between the magnets changes flavor. It's no longer asking for a substance, like smoke or fluid. It's asking about the state of space itself. Is it uniform or not? Is it indifferent or informed? Try another experiment in your imagination. Suspend a magnet so it can rotate freely. It lines up with the Earth. Why? Because the Earth itself is a magnet. That means right now, as you sit there, the space around you has a direction. North is not just a label on a map. It's a physical orientation written into the environment. You're swimming in it, completely unaware, like a fish asking where the water is. And that should bother you a little, because if space can have direction, then it's not nothing. Nothing doesn't have direction. Nothing doesn't care which way you turn. Yet space seems to care quite a lot. People sometimes object at this point and say, you're just renaming the problem. You're calling it a field, but you haven't explained what the field is made of. And that's a fair complaint, but it hides a deeper assumption that everything real must be made of something else. Atoms made of particles, particles made of smaller particles, turtles all the way down. But maybe that instinct is the thing that's misleading us. Maybe the field isn't made of anything in the usual sense. Maybe it's not a thing sitting in space at all. Maybe it's a description of how space behaves. Think about temperature. Temperature isn't a substance. You can't scoop hot into a cup. It's a way of describing motion, a summary of behavior. In the same way, the magnetic field might not be a material filling space, but a way of describing how objects will respond if they find themselves there. That idea feels slippery at first, because we like our explanations to be concrete. We want gears and springs and little billiard balls colliding. But nature doesn't seem obligated to satisfy that craving. It's perfectly content to say, here are the rules. Follow them. And the rules for magnetism are astonishingly consistent. Change the distance and the force changes smoothly. Rotate the magnet and the pattern rotates with it. Bring in another magnet and the whole situation rearranges itself without confusion. Like a group of dancers adjusting to a new partner without missing a beat. What's especially revealing is that magnets don't get tired. They don't wear out from influencing space. They don't lose strength just because the field exists. That tells you the field isn't a drain on the magnet like water leaking from a tank. It's more like a posture the magnet adopts, and space responds accordingly. Now here's where curiosity really starts to itch. If space can be in different states, if it can be arranged, oriented, energized, then what happens when those states change? Can they move? Can they ripple? Can they carry energy from one place to another? The answer, of course, is yes. But even before you know that formally, your hand's already suspected. When you snap two magnets together, there's motion. Energy is released. That energy didn't teleport from nowhere. It came from a rearrangement of the configuration of the space between them. The tension in the space relaxed. Once you start thinking this way, magnets stop being special curiosities and start looking like a clue. A clue that the universe doesn't operate purely by objects whispering secrets across emptiness, but by objects shaping the environment they live in. And now the invisible thing between the magnets feels less like a ghost and more like a landscape. A landscape you can't see, but one you can feel, measure, and predict. A landscape that quietly dictates how matter moves, how energy flows, and how order emerges. But this idea carries a quiet threat, because if magnetism works this way, then it's probably not alone. And if other forces behave similarly, then space itself is starting to look less like a backdrop and more like a participant. And once you admit that, you're no longer just asking what's between two magnets. You're asking what space really is, and whether it's been fooling us all along. If you're ready, we can follow that thought where it naturally leads, and it leads somewhere wonderfully uncomfortable. Now comes the part where your intuition really starts to protest, because the closer you look, the less the universe behaves like a collection of objects, and the more it behaves like a set of rules written into space itself. You might think the magnetic field is just a clever bookkeeping trick, a mathematical convenience, a way to organize predictions. And for a while, physicists were quite happy to think of it that way. After all, if the equations work, why worry too much about what's really there? But magnetism refuses to stay quietly abstract. It insists on showing up in places where bookkeeping shouldn't be able to do any work at all. Here's a small but devastating observation. A magnetic field can store energy, not metaphorically. Literally, you can calculate how much energy exists in a region of space purely because of how the field is arranged there. And when that arrangement changes, energy moves, it flows, it turns into motion, heat, light. That means the field isn't just describing what might happen. It's something from which things can happen. Now pause and let that sink in. Energy is one of our most reliable currencies of reality. If something can store energy, exchange energy, transport energy, then whatever philosophical doubts you have, nature is treating it as real, and this energy doesn't live inside the magnets alone. If it did, separating the magnets wouldn't change anything. But it does. The energy depends on the configuration of the field in the space between them. Spread out, twisted, compressed. You move the magnets, and the energy redistributes smoothly through the surrounding space, like tension shifting through a stretched net. So when you hold two magnets apart and feel that resistance, you are not just fighting the magnets. You are fighting a particular state of space that would very much like to rearrange itself. This leads to a deeply counterintuitive idea. Forces don't really act directly between objects. Objects act on space, and space acts on objects. The magnet changes the field changes the motion of other things. The magnet never reaches out and grabs anything. It simply sits there, and the space around it does the persuasion. That might sound like splitting hairs, but it changes everything. Because once you accept that, you no longer need mysterious action at a distance. Nothing jumps across the gap. Nothing cheats. All the influence is local. Every little region of space responds only to what's happening right there. The field at one point influences the field next door, and so on, like a line of people passing along a message by tapping shoulders. This is how nature avoids magic while still surprising you. And here's the truly sneaky part. These fields can move even when the magnets don't. If you wiggle a magnet back and forth, the changes in the field don't appear everywhere at once. They spread outward at a finite speed. The disturbance travels. That means the field isn't just a static arrangement. It's a dynamic thing. It has its own behavior, its own inertia, its own way of responding to change. In fact, if you shake things just right, the field detaches itself entirely and goes roaming through space as light. That's not poetry. That's a literal statement about how electricity and magnetism are stitched together. A changing magnetic field creates an electric field. A changing electric field creates a magnetic field. Once that loop gets going, the fields can sustain each other and travel on their own, no magnets required. Light is what space does when its electromagnetic rules start oscillating. So now the question, what's between the magnets, has an answer that's both satisfying and unsettling. What's between them is the same thing that carries radio waves, sunlight, Wi-Fi, and the warmth on your face. The same invisible structure that can vibrate, twist, store energy, and propagate across the universe. And here's where the brain really threatens to crack. If the field can exist without the magnets once it's set in motion, then the field is not merely a property of the magnets. It's a thing in its own right. Not a material thing like a rock or a chair, but a physical entity with its own degrees of freedom. At this point, people often ask, okay, but what is the field made of? And that question quietly assumes there must be a deeper layer underneath, some medium, some substance, some hidden machinery. But every attempt to invent such a medium ends up either contradicting experiments or recreating the field in disguise. Eventually, you're forced to consider a more radical possibility. Maybe the field is fundamental. Maybe there is no smaller explanation waiting underneath. Maybe space itself comes with built-in rules that allow these fields to exist, evolve, and interact. That's uncomfortable because it means explanation has a stopping point. Not a wall you hit because you're ignorant, but a foundation you stand on because that's how reality is arranged. And once you accept that, magnetism stops being a curiosity and starts being a window, a demonstration that the universe is not made only of things but of relationships. Not just objects, but patterns of influence written into the fabric of space. By now, the magnets themselves have almost faded into the background. They're just props. What really matters is the stage they disturb and the silent structure that responds. And if space can do all of this, if it can carry energy, transmit influence, and give rise to light itself, then the final question is no longer about magnets at all. The final question is what it means for reality when the emptiest thing we can imagine turns out to be the most active. And that question doesn't belong to physics alone anymore. So now we step back, because once you followed the thread this far, it would be a shame not to see where it's woven into the rest of reality. At the beginning, you were holding two magnets and wondering what invisible thing was tugging at your hands. By now, the magnets themselves almost feel like an excuse. The real revelation is that space is not a passive void, but a participant with rules, memory, and behavior. And once you accept that, the universe starts to look less like a warehouse full of objects and more like a living system of interactions. Think about how strange that is from a human point of view. For most of history, nothing was the easiest concept we had. Empty space was just the absence of stuff. You couldn't build anything out of it. You couldn't blame anything on it. It was where nothing happened. And yet modern physics keeps discovering that the more carefully you remove everything, the more structure you uncover. Directions, energies, fluctuations, possibilities. The magnets taught you that empty space can be tense. Light teaches you that empty space can vibrate. And gravity, if you let it, will eventually teach you that empty space can bend. All of this hints at a universe that is less like a machine assembled from parts and more like a melody defined by relationships. Notes don't exist by themselves. They exist by how they relate in time and frequency. In the same way, objects don't act in isolation. They participate in fields, and the fields define what actions are even possible. What's especially humbling is how little of this depends on us. The magnetic field doesn't care if you believe in it. It doesn't care if you understand it. It doesn't even care if you have a name for it. It quietly shapes, compasses stars and atoms whether anyone is watching or not. Reality is under no obligation to match the categories your mind finds comfortable. And yet, somehow your mind can reach out and grasp it, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to predict, to build, to play. That's the quiet miracle hidden in all of this. The same brain that evolved to throw rocks and avoid predators can also imagine invisible fields filling space and get the math right often enough to send signals across the planet. When you ask what's between the magnets, you're really asking a deeper question. Is reality made of things, or is it made of rules? Are objects primary, or are relationships? Magnetism gently nudges you toward the second answer. The magnets matter, yes, but what truly governs their behavior is the invisible structure they participate in. And here's the final twist that makes the whole story feel slightly mischievous. If you could somehow remove the magnets entirely, remove every particle, every atom, every photon, you still wouldn't be left with nothing in the naive sense. You'd be left with space that has the capacity to host fields, to fluctuate, to allow possibilities. A kind of fertile emptiness. That means the most fundamental ingredient of the universe may not be matter at all, but the stage on which matter dances. Not the actors, but the choreography. So the next time you hold two magnets and feel that quiet, stubborn resistance in your hands, you're not just feeling a force. You're feeling a conversation between objects and space. A reminder that the universe is deeper than it looks, and that nothing is one of its most interesting inventions. And maybe that's the most brain-breaking answer of all. Between the magnets is not a thing you can point to, but a structure you can't escape. The same structure that lets light travel, time flow, and the universe exist in the first place, not bad for two little chunks of metal.